through these next couple of days, we're going to hear quite a lot about the how of APIs and the what it takes to create an API. What I wanted to do for a few minutes now is really just take a step back and talk about why. So in the world we're kind of heading for, APIs are around the way that businesses interact with each other, interact with people. And if the initiative is to be successful, APIs are about creating better business partnerships. And this is in the context of a rapidly changing world, of course. And we all talk about the mega trends of IT change, social media, big data, cloud, mobile. API has something to say in all of those spaces. But to really just take me through the kind of path that I want to follow for these next few remarks, really I want to think about cloud and mobile as two of the influences which drive and enable the API world, because they have subtly different effects on what this means for an enterprise IT landscape and the folks who operate it and drive its direction forward. So let's think about cloud. I really come from an enterprise computing background. So cloud for me has been around a different choice of application platform. So I'm choosing Salesforce rather than Siebel. That allows me to bring that application on quicker. Maybe I didn't have to engage IT too closely when I made that buying decision. I've got my CRM system. It does create an integration problem for my enterprise. That's for them to worry about, obviously, back in IT. But there's also a different category of cloud user, which kind of feeds into the API space. Because you can have enterprise quality cloud infrastructure, folks like Heroku, anybody can create an application that would be acceptable against enterprise type attributes. And that means that startups can add value to a traditional enterprise much more quickly and at much lower capital investment than previously. So sitting inside my enterprise, it means that I'm much less certain about who my business partners are and will be. So when I'm thinking about business partnerships, there's a group of folks I know about and a group of folks that I don't, who may have value that they can offer me. So really this is around a speed of change thing and a general uncertainty. But it does mean that as an enterprise, maybe it's appropriate for me to think about really what it is that I have in information terms that other folks can make use of, and perhaps what information I could have if I was gathering data more carefully from all the activities that I undertake. And we have some interesting examples emerging where new data sources are being created and leveraged through APIs. Of course, the mobile effect, is well known, and you get all the wonder statistics of more mobile phones and toothbrushes, and more mobile phones and people, and all of those kinds of interesting dynamics. But it's certainly clear that technology is in the hands of the consumer. So this is a good time to be working in IT, because finally it's cool. Right? We're no longer just a cost. We're no longer just a constraint on the business. We are some kind of enablement of how a business engages consumers and engages its end users. And of course, if you'd thought about API construction a few years ago, maybe you would have missed this mobile device trend. So when organizations created their first generation website, nobody was really worrying too much about how it was going to show on a tiny screen, whether a native application on some other kind of platform would actually be a better way of engaging than some standard kind of HTML type effect. The point being here that times change very fast. And even if you have to choose how you're going to create your API today for some specific set of users, you're bound to be wrong against what it would have to be in several years' time. So the idea of creating value that will last is actually a pretty difficult question to answer without being clairvoyant. And the Internet of Things, is kind of the personification of that. That whatever devices you think you're going to engage with now, it will be different. So maybe it will be smart meters and smart grid controls. Maybe it will be connected cars, connected homes, intelligent toasters, smart and shiny fridges. Different devices, different channels are coming. They will use different technologies. So although REST and JSON seems to be the choice with no need to question it at the moment, in the coming years, of course, that will be different. Embedded devices might use MQTT, for example. So even WebSockets on HTML5, already some of the choices are becoming less clear again. So it's all about change. It's all about diversity. It's all about uncertainty. But what is pretty certain is that the overall landscape will change along this kind of model. That maybe a shrinking set of internal enterprise applications are being managed directly by the organisation, but actually the scope and reach of the IT function has now extended further into cloud-based applications. Perhaps they own themselves in a private cloud. Maybe they take a software as a service. Maybe they engage directly with partners' applications. And they definitely, engage through multiple channels out to the world. So there's certain delayering. We can talk about 3 layers. I saw an enterprise architecture just the other day which had 5 or 6 layers of this type and many intermediating devices. I think it's going to take a long time for stuff to get to the front and back of that architecture. So as simple as possible is always good, but there's definitely different characteristics. And I think everybody here would probably sign up to the idea that APIs are the way that those layers are going to be stuck together. And I think, as was mentioned earlier, the concept of API isn't new. Some of the functions that the APIs are doing aren't particularly new. So it's really just a maturing and a shifting gear on thinking that's been around for quite a good many years. As I say, I've done a lot of enterprise integration using messages, a lot of B2B integration in the early days using XML over HTTP. We're gradually increasing the immediacy of interaction between organizations. But fundamentally, some of the outcomes we're looking for are the same in terms of lower cost of operating business models, in terms of bringing new propositions to market, targeting new markets, the things that we have to offer. And APIs are key. Now, one of the interesting things about this, of course, is that these are now so key and so obvious as part of the value chain that the genuine business side of enterprises has some kind of interest in APIs. Back in the day of SOA, when people used to ask me, how do I explain to the business what an SOA will deliver? I would say, don't even try. They really don't care. With APIs, we are seeing initiatives start entirely on the business side, which can lead to all kinds of havoc, clearly. But certainly there is always a very serious conversation to be had between business and IT about what exactly the purpose of the activity is, why we're doing APIs in the first place. And I think when we're thinking about APIs in this kind of context, I'm kind of taking on board some of the things that Adam was saying earlier about these different maturity models, about trying stuff and getting caught out by how the market reacts to what you've done, about maintaining business partnerships over the long term, which means not closing down APIs that your trusted business partners are relying upon, and so forth. There's a much bigger picture than just a bit of fancy coding to get some handy-looking API up quickly. It's part of a bigger picture. So it's an API world. As I've mentioned, diversity is already present. And I think one of the interesting things that we see about this kind of range of devices and range of channels is that they do have a certain industry-specific relevance, so that things like the connected appliance, connected car, clearly very big to the manufacturing organisations. Things like embedded devices. We're seeing quite a lot of that in kind of complex retail environments, where many devices interact to actually create the customer experience, all of which have to be controlled. And clearly, things like consoles and tablets, smart TVs, and so forth. What we're seeing is that different industries are seeking different kinds of business leverage from APIs, depending on the problems that they've got to solve. Right? That's pretty obvious. What we're also then seeing is that when one leader in a particular industry has the bright idea, everybody else has to move pretty quickly to cover what they've done. So there is a need for innovation in the business use of APIs, but also the need for very fast reaction if somebody comes up with the cracking idea that you've got to have. So because of all that kind of difficulty in speed of reaction, diversity, I think it's important that enterprises don't think that they've got all the best ideas. Okay. What this picture is supposed to kind of illustrate is how, back in the day, an enterprise would do everything in red here. So they'd have the back-end systems. They'd understand how they were going to be secured, how they were going to be presented to applications. They would even deliver that application to end users. So they'd build the whole stack from the front piece of glass back to the silicon at the back end grinding away. That obviously gives you full control, but it limits your productivity and your rate of change. So clearly, if you want to motivate APIs for business users, you say, well, actually, in an API world, we're just going to focus on those red things in the middle now. Some of that other stuff, some of the other stuff in green, for example, we're going to allow other folks to do for us, to create applications for us based on our core information and functional resources. And clearly that's going to mean we can do more. So the folks we pay will be building APIs, and folks we don't pay will be using them, potentially. And it gives that kind of greater entropy in your IT world. And that can be both a good thing and a bad thing. Generally speaking, business will see that as a good thing. So the kinds of things that business will be talking about are usually externally facing. But there are certainly an internally facing set of attributes that can allow you to kind of get warmed up on the technology. So the idea of enabling mobile workforces, we see quite commonly. That can work in sales organisations, government organisations, for example. That gives the opportunity to pretty much work through most of the disciplines of API development, deployment, and management without necessarily the risk of doing it badly. So the reputational risk of having a dud API is clearly a bit of an issue. And also the risk of having an API which is wildly successful and then crashes in the first 5 minutes. That's also a potential risk. So we see organisations sometimes starting their API journey on an internal initiative. I kind of recommend against that, really. I think it's a little bit too reserved, not quite bold enough, because so often the business benefit of those kinds of initiatives, doesn't create the kind of lighthouse project inside an organisation that really drives further adoption and drives momentum. So my preference really is to, look for opportunities which go somewhere beyond the boundary of the enterprise. So let's do it for real. Ideally with limited risk. So maybe we're talking about selected partners rather than mass public, if that fits the business model and fits the industry. And try to do something which is not too difficult to start with. Because when we come to engaging with end customers, we really are putting the brand of the organisation on the line. One of the things that it occurred to me when I was talking to one of our prospects who's in the kind of hotel and leisure industry, their API initiative is really around composing APIs from other resource providers. So effectively to allow their branded application to create complete package experiences, even though they only provide part of the service in the end. And I was thinking, well, why would this effectively hotel and entertainment brand want to be doing that? And it's because they want to get their brand onto your smartphone. And you probably only have 20 or 25 apps on your smartphone. Once I'm up to about page 4, anything beyond that never gets seen, never gets used, and will get deleted. So there's effectively a competition for app space. And that's why, a bit of originality around the information that gets provided is essential to make these things really compelling and really sticky. The B2B partnerships, as I mentioned, this is really kind of at the heart of where APIs will really generate value. And I guess these are the ones we see most commonly amongst our customers. And it's because they're kind of retreading well-established roads. So you probably have links with B2B partners through some kinds of integration. You already have the dialogues, you already have the commercial contracts in place. And that means you can kind of move ahead into this new world and say, well, now what do we do? We already understand our business model jointly. Now what do we do with this new technology? And we're seeing particularly industries where the services are relatively abstract. So financial services, banking, insurance, the idea of white label services where an organisation effectively conceals its brand behind somebody else's. APIs are kind of perfect for that seamless integration of one organisation's business capabilities into another's. And then there are, the ideas that are right out there. Some of them have been written about in science fiction for many years. So the intelligent car, David Hasselhoff in the 1980s, kit car, fantastic, right? Auto manufacturers are now starting to run their connected car programs. They're starting to advertise their cars based on the apps that are on the in-car display. So the world is kind of changing around. Some of that's around consumer sensitivity. Some of that is really around the manufacturer's own interests. So it's a mixture of marketing hype and real delivery. But fundamentally, as the world fills up with connected devices, bright people will come up with good ideas of how they get joined together. And Pete mentioned earlier the idea of healthcare monitoring. We're seeing that very strongly, both in healthcare facilities where it's many monitors letting you know the condition of a particular patient, but also out in the real world, with wearable healthcare data devices, 24-hour blood pressure monitors, those kinds of things being part of an API and connected world. It's going to produce huge amounts of data of huge value to various industries. As I mentioned, industries are, right now, most people are basically playing to their strengths, and this makes perfect sense. So if you have a service from an organisation that can be sensibly abstracted, let's do that. So it's a payment card, it's a payment service, it's loyalty programs where you're gathering spending points, those kinds of things, very suitable for API usage. As well as I mentioned, this kind of composition of services on a consumer focus. So if I'm going to go and have my holiday in Las Vegas, that's what I want to buy. I don't necessarily want to buy a flight and a hotel and a car. Package it up, present it to me, give me the best price, give me money off. All of these things are good. But what it means is an organisation has quite a lot of places where it can look for how it can exploit APIs. So I've been working on my alphabet here, and I'm doing all right. A couple of problems. But the way, as I've mentioned, you connect to cloud applications, the way a business connects to other businesses, the way it connects to consumers, developers, its employees, something beginning with F that I can't think of, government, bit of a problem in H as well, and then the Internet of Things. The CEO of SOA Software basically says, his credo is that every organisation will do nearly all of these eventually. But where to start? Okay, depends on business model, depends on maturity of the infrastructure, depends on market presence, depends on competitor activity, but it does very much feed back to a key part of business strategy, which means you have to listen to business folks talking about business things. Because the way that IT supports that partnership community is now is changing, and the potential role and range of partners is growing very quickly. And it's probably best if you don't do this randomly, because as some of the very fast-growing API-based companies have shown, there is a lot of money to be gained here, as well as cost to be lost. So we really encourage, I say companies here, but governments as well, to make sure they've got a strategy for what they're trying to achieve from a business point of view. And one of the ways we can help, the IT community can help business, is with examples, of course. So it's well worth understanding where competitors are working, where trends in analogous industries are going, so that in that conversation between IT leadership and business leadership, there is a kind of a cross-fertilization of ideas rather than just having to respond to what the business wants to do. And then secondly, this piece about making an API a first-class enterprise citizen. It's very important that this really does work for the long term. And that's because, as we talked about, you're going to be engaging with third parties. So you have to have the API make sense from the outside. This is very much what Ronnie was talking about. You know, the idea that when SOA was created, one of its failings perhaps was what it tended to be built from the back up. APIs have to work from the top down. They have to make sense and they have to be usable. The idea that Adam mentioned of APIs as a product, we think that's key. Now that will define a lot of business governance around them in terms of a marketing strategy, product ownership, product life cycles, including perhaps product retirement concepts for how APIs will end their lives. And they have to be funded as a product. Again, SOA always struggled as the poor child who was hanging off other people's project budgets and never really getting the opportunity to invest. You know, because the API is the product, it's the API in which you invest. So that hopefully, when that's made clear, that works better. But the organisation then has to be ready to respond to the product that it's created. And that means support mechanisms and engagement mechanisms. For the API platform point of view, you know, IT always promises things quicker, so the business gets off their back, but productivity is going to be important here. You know, we've talked about the speed of change. We've talked about the competitive pressures that will arrive. That means having a very productive way of creating, deploying, evolving APIs is going to be terribly important. But, as I've said, with enterprise attributes. So, as Pete was mentioning, it's got to be secure. Everybody worries about that in a different way, but we don't get far into an API conversation before somebody says, yeah, but what about security of our data? And the big one for me is sustainability. You know, we've talked about Google culling APIs like it's going out of fashion. You know, for many enterprises, that isn't really going to work. You know, these initiatives will have to be sustainable. So you've got to make it work for a long time. You've got to understand what it is that you've done. And that means we think for the API technology platform, quite apart from the APIs themselves, you know, the actual functional offering, we need that way to understand how the APIs are being used. Okay, are people doing what we thought they were going to do, or is the way that calls are being made, you know, different? When Ronnie was talking about, you know, how many calls does it take people to achieve something, you know, is that analysis working out as we would have expected and as we would have liked, or do we need to make changes? We have to work with the developers so they can be part of our system, to find, you know, use APIs, to comment, to suggest, you know, to help us innovate. And then, you know, where the rubber hits the road, the services have to run. Now, Pete talked a lot about mediation on services, and we think that's going to be terribly important. The security mediation question comes up pretty much in every initiative now. Often, particularly in fact, where organisations have done good work on SOA, so they do have good SOAP web services, you know, secured in a way appropriate to the internal needs of a business, but now they want to make them OAuth, REST, JSON. So, you know, mediation is kind of a key feature of that gateway service piece, as well as all the usual things of abstraction. And we think lifecycle management will become more and more recognised as an important part of this. So getting version 2 or 3, whichever one first goes public, fabulously successful, that's great. But this is now a product of the organisation, and it needs to be managed through appropriate business governance. All the more so where it starts to compose functionality from different business functions. So you get all the old cross-functional arguments within an organisation, where ownership is clear, where approval is required. It's all terribly dull, and it kind of sounds counter-innovation, but effectively it's the necessary evil. So we have to make that as easy as possible to get it out of the way. So when SOA Software approach this area, we're kind of grouping those into those 3 areas. When we're talking about the community, engaging the community, that's both the developers who are going to use the APIs, the API owners who are going to kind of put them out to the market. So the analytics works both ways. You know, what am I using? Who is using my APIs? Unified gateway, that's the idea of security, scalability, and indirection, composition of APIs and so forth. And the idea of the way assets get moved around through Lifecycle Manager. To your question earlier around, does that mean cloud, premise, a mixture? We are really seeing organisations do all 3. Nearly everybody starts as all cloud. And nearly everybody thinks they're going to go to one of these 2. And we're seeing different rates of change, different rates of progress across here. Some organisations, I wonder if they will ever actually make the step that they thought they were going to make. So we're seeing maturity there. We think flexibility is very important in that piece. But the real outcome here is that, if we go back one, is that more folks will interact in more different ways. It all got more complicated all of a sudden. And managing that interaction is going to be a necessary part of making change rapid and predictable. APIs have to be built from the outside in. We heard about that earlier, because they're products of the company and represent the brand value. And the real prize is that idea of collaborative innovation. Other people will think of things to do with your data that you didn't think. And as long as you've got your security right and your usage policies right, that's all goodness. So I think it's something to be embraced. I did some studies some years ago around how you industrialize innovation in an organization and in an ecosystem. And it's around creating the right amount of structure to get things working, but not actually get in the way. And really, that's what API management is about. It means that the APIs infrastructure will be robust, but folks can still innovate quickly. Thank you.